I'm Jeff Hulett, founder and president of Personal Finance Reimagined. Our organization is dedicated to helping clients and students master their decision process. We operate by an old saying, if you name it, you can tame it. This means understanding the essential, often hidden inputs to your decisions can help you navigate complexity better. Our discussion goes beyond decision process. It's about naming the big foundational trends still impacting us today. By identifying these challenges, we believe you gain the clarity to make better decisions today to create better outcomes for tomorrow. In my decades of behavioral economic research, I found that the 1970s, just as in a historical decade, it's a crucial intersection where cultural, historical, and even evolutionary paths fundamentally realigned. We'll explore these observations today because my ultimate aim is to help you become a better decision maker in our complex world. The 1970s linger in our memory as a hazy period of disco, gas lines, and regrettable fashion. Yet beneath the bell-bottoms and stagflation lay the most profound structural shift in the modern world. That decade didn't just give us the digital seed of the personal computer, it fundamentally rewired our money, our medicine, and our global order. It was the moment the US dollar broke its anchor to gold, transforming currency into a weapon of political will. It also saw quiet zoning codes become the new architecture of social division. It is when the American healthcare industry learned to profit not just from health today, but from enabling chronic illness tomorrow. Every defining challenge of our current world, from relentless boom-bust cycles to algorithmic inequality and the debt spiral, was engineered in the shadows of the 1970s. To understand the present, we must look beyond the caricature and grasp the new operating installed almost 50 years ago. These changes were not loud revolutions, but quiet rewrites of the rules that still govern our politics, markets, and daily lives. The foundations of today's political polarization, economic volatility, and attention-driven culture were laid in these years. There are 8 core shifts from the 1970s reshaping our world today. Not just in what we buy or how we vote, but in how power, influence, and scarcity, economic scarcity, operates. If you want to understand today's headlines, start with this underappreciated yet massively influential decade. Next, I will introduce the 8 core shifts before digging deeper into each shift. Then at the end, we will discuss 1, how these shifts impact our day-to-day world, and then 2, what you can do about it. Next, let me introduce the 8 core shifts. We will start with first. You can check out our scary dollar monster. We will discuss how moving off the gold standard and moving toward petrodollars created insatiable incentives for politicians and bureaucrats alike. 2, we will discuss how changes like primary voting have made a massive change in our democracy. 3, we will discuss the massive impact of the information age and how the economic battleground is now inside all of our heads. 4, we will explain how the era of big government got a massive gravity assist in the 1970s. And then 5, we will discuss how the well-intended Civil Rights Act didn't stop discrimination, it just moved it to make housing unaffordable. 6, we'll discuss how the U.S. medical system has devolved to medical procedures enhancing this quarter's profits and creating a portfolio of unhealthy but profitable future customers. Finally, for honorable mention, we'll discuss the emergence of China and how well-intended environmental policies have devolved into greenwashing. 1, the insatiable dollar. why politicians can't stop using currency to buy tomorrow's crisis. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a truly pivotal decision. He unilaterally cut the dollar's final link to gold, effectively ending the fixed exchange rate system established at Bretton Woods after World War II. This single act transformed the U.S. into a pure fiat currency, or the U.S. dollar into a pure fiat currency. What that means is it's no longer backed by anything, including gold, other than the reputation of the U.S. government. Now, the freedom this gave the central banks was huge: flexibility to manage the money supply and control rates. But there was a critical and massive downside. That gold standard had served as the primary external constraint that disciplined politicians' appetite for debt-fueled spending. It was a little like giving the keys of our liquor cabinet to an alcoholic relative. Once that tether was gone, the new system became an enabler. The ability to print money and reduced interest rates gave politicians an easy way to finance even larger deficits, which in turn amplifies the boom-bust cycle. They just got bigger. And it's inevitably what it does is it requires deeper and more aggressive intervention every time. The immediate consequence was instability. Throughout the 1970s, the U.S. economy faced stagflation, which is a toxic combination of high inflation and slow growth. The dollar was swinging wildly, and policymakers had to act. Then, to add fuel to the fire, to restore global demand for this newly unbacked currency, the U.S. engineered the 1974 petrodollar system with Saudi Arabia. All global oil would be priced and traded exclusively in dollars. This effectively replaced the gold anchor with a demand anchor tied to the world's essential energy supply. This also fueled massive dollar recycling back to Wall Street, creating huge global capital flows. This may all sound good, but the systemic results is what we've lived through for the last 50 years. Okay, and that is the increased frequency of financial crises, especially systemic banking crises. To fight these downturns, from the savings and loan crisis all the way to 2008 and now then to 2020, central banks have increasingly relied on radical interventions. Okay, so each crisis is met by dropping the Fed funds rate, which is the short-term rate that the Federal Reserve uses to manage their monetary policy, or parts of their monetary policy, important parts of their monetary policy. But that Fed funds rate had to be progressively lower historically at every crisis. Okay, so they had to, and then employ unprecedented asset purchases known as quantitative easing. So concurrently, the US national debt as a percentage of GDP continues on its sharp rise. The policy of deficit spending enabled the unconstrained fiat currency has simply become the norm. The evidence is clear. The very tools used to stabilize the economy, unrestricted credit expansion and debt-based stimulus, create the financial imbalances that lead to the next crash. The fix for the prior crisis lays the structural foundation for a larger, more debt-intensive crisis in the future. In other words, the lows of each cycle are only avoided by becoming more desperate. As we always advise our clients, once you find yourself in a hole, the best thing to do is to stop digging. Unfortunately, the US government only seems to find bigger shovels to dig our hole deeper. So before going to the next 1970s impact, where we're going to talk a little bit about politics, notice the red and blue shadings on that debt line. They represent the different political parties of the sitting president at the time. So that's red for Republican and blue for Democrat. The takeaway is that all the presidents spend liberally, as you'll notice, except for the presidency of Bill Clinton, but he was an aberration, I believe. But anyway, the takeaway is that all presidents spend liberally. It is really a question of what they spend those massive budgets upon. And that spending is impacted by the crisis of the day. Thanks for that, 1970s. Two, the primary system that undermined democracy. Now we will pivot to politics. In the aftermath of the turbulent 1968 Democratic Convention, well-meaning reformers created the McGovern-Fraser Commission, the outcome of which led to a massive structural shift, introducing primaries and caucuses to selected presidential candidates, which started in 1972. The Democratic goal was clear: shift power from Washington party insiders straight to the voters. Well, it didn't quite work out this way, but it was a well-meaning idea, but it had massive long-term and largely negative consequences. First, moderation collapsed. Candidates no longer had to appeal to broad coalitions. They were now incentivized to focus on energizing a smaller, more extreme ideological base to win the primary. Second, fundraising overtook governing. Success in the primaries became dependent on media performance and access to major donors, not coalition building or legislative skill. This new dynamic absolutely exploded congressional dysfunction. Elected officials learned quickly that their biggest threat wasn't losing the general election, it was a primary challenge from their own pure political flank. This results in rigid partisanship and performative politics that we now see every day. Today, party leadership in Congress dictates outcomes not through debate, but through top-down negotiating and fundraising quotas. Legislators rarely write laws. They vote on massive omnibus packages designed to satisfy narrow donor classes and ideological wings. John Adams, one of our founders and our second president, gave us a powerful warning, saying he dreaded nothing so much as the division of the republic into two great parties, calling it the greatest political evil under our Constitution. Well, that political evil is now normalized. McGovern-Fraser reforms did not democratize politics, they fragmented it. Shifting the true power from voters to funders, the resulting party line voting has changed drastically since 1972. Just take a look at that, showing just how much leadership drives outcomes versus how much freedom lawmakers have to represent our actual interests. The primary system has allowed the two dominant parties to colonize our legislative branch. Thanks, 1970s. 3, the attention economy, from information scarcity to attention scarcity. In the old industrial economy, value is defined by scarcity, land, labor, and capital. When the market era arrived, it created what economist Deirdre McCloskey calls the Great Enrichment, lifting billions out of poverty and generating massive wealth. Notice the GDP's massive increase over the last few centuries. The gray line on this graphic has increased over 50 times. Orders of magnitude. The market era has created massive value. But the newest era, the information age, has completely shifted the economic battlefield right inside our heads. The core principle remains the same. The value lies in what is scarce. In an age of information abundance, where we are today, in an age of information abundance where knowledge itself is infinite, the single most valuable scarce resource is human attention. The late 1970s marked the start of this shift. When Apple released Apple I in 1976, it catalyzed the new infrastructure for abundance, powered by Moore's law and rapidly increasing bandwidth. That created the flood of data where newspapers gave way to search engines and television gave way to infinite scroll. The economic imperative changed radically. We moved from businesses competing to control supply to businesses competing to capture your demand by influencing your behavior at the level of our neurobiology, your time, your clicks, and cognitive bandwidth. Today's most powerful companies, Meta, Google, TikTok, etc., don't actually sell knowledge. They sell curated attention attractors. optimizing to hijack your dopaminergic reward system. Notifications, reels, algorithmic feeds trigger instant gratification, fine-tuning their systems and turning your engagement into a reoccurring revenue stream. The implications extend far beyond your phone. This cognitive overload undermines critical thinking, polarizing content outperforms nuance, and weakens democratic discourse. And mental health suffers. Scarcity used to exist in the external world, and that was in the raw materials and goods. Today, the most intense market competition lives entirely inside your and our heads. The 1970s built the infrastructure for information abundance, but with it came a new frontier of exploitation, the competition for your mind. Thanks, 1970s. 4. Regulatory realignment, not just deregulation. The 1970s did not shrink government, they fundamentally reshaped it. While we saw some high-profile deregulation in sectors like airlines and trucking, simultaneously, social and environmental regulation exploded at an historical pace. Agencies like OSHA, the EPA, and the EEOC gained sweeping authority over everything from workplace safety to environmental policy. The focus shifted dramatically from setting prices to enforcing compliance, fairness, and risk mitigation. This graph shows the explosion of regulation in the 1970s, as found in the Federal Register, and the Federal Register is where laws are recorded. The results, as Thomas Sowell might observe, often reflected the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies. These new regulations imposed heavy compliance costs, which often slowed innovation and diverted essential resources away from productive investment and straight into administrative overhead. These hidden costs, spread across millions of private decisions, quietly slowed economic dynamism for more than policymakers ever anticipated. While the seeds of the modern regulatory state were planted much earlier, the 1970s marked its maturity, cementing a model where political incentives, rather than genuine market feedback, increasingly dictated economic outcomes. Thanks, 1970s. 5. Now let's talk about one of my personal favorites, the birth of unaffordable housing. This is arguably the most bizarre hidden impact of the 1970s. It is the ultimate example of good intentions leading to horrible systemic outcomes. The affordability crisis didn't begin with a crash. It began with a rule book. While we often blame rising rates and interest rates, the deeper cause of the home ownership challenges is very subtle. Local land use regulations and NIMBYism devolved into second-order tools of discrimination. After the Civil Rights Act outlawed explicit bias, the 1970s saw a surge in zoning rules that preserved exclusion by other quieter means. What was once outright became what was spoken outright, right? Meaning in terms of discrimination, ultimately became embedded code, quietly deciding not only who gets to live where, but who reaps massive wealth gains. So look at the graph. That expanding reddish gap between median home prices on the top and median personal income on the bottom is the affordability crisis in raw numbers. Under the banner of preserving community character and protecting home values, local governments adopted policies restricting density, banning multifamily housing, and imposing costly building requirements. These rules were framed as neutral, but their effects were anything but. They created artificial scarcity, effectively locking lower income and minority families out of high opportunity areas and turning housing into a gatekeeping system. We traded dynamic adaptability for regulatory exclusion. Instead of allowing supply to adjust to demand, we essentially froze our cities in time, enshrining the preferences of current homeowners and insulating them from demographic and economic change. It is, quite frankly, just another form of systemic racism. As Jerusalem Demas noted in the Atlantic article, a home's value is directly tied to the scarcity of housing for other people. This system, by its nature, pits incumbents against newcomers, homeowners against their children. The promise of equal opportunities was fundamentally undercut, not by open resistance, but by local zoning quietly wielded as a new powerful form of control. To solve today's affordability crisis, we have to go beyond just building more homes. We must dismantle that zoning and regulatory sediment that has buried opportunity layer by well-meaning layer. Thanks, 1970s. All right, let's move on. Number 6, healthcare's hidden pivot. By the end of the 1970s, U.S. healthcare quietly jumped into a new unsustainable economic trajectory. In 1970, spending was about 6% of GDP. Today, it's closer to 18%. The steep climb traces back to the complete rewrite of the financial incentives in medicine. The pivot started with Medicare and Medicaid hitting their full stride, expanding guaranteed payment streams for providers. Outside of those programs, the system's costs were amassed by employer-provided health insurance. This reliance fueled the fee-for-service model, which financially rewards providers for immediate, high-volume procedures, not for long-term prevention or wellness. Think about the incentive structure. From the employer's point of view, the goal is repair so you can work care. Okay, let me say that again. The employer goal is repair, as in their employee, repair so you can work care. It prioritizes getting an employee back to the job quickly versus an over-investing in comprehensive long-term health, which might require more upfront costs or time off. This fundamental misalignment drives up overall costs while actively sidelining durable health improvements. The problem is a marketing problem. Our system is called healthcare, but a more accurate name would be that repair so you can return to work care. The hidden pivot of the 1970s set the stage for a system that excels at acute intervention but struggles with prevention and cost control, leaving America with longer lifespans but shorter health spans. Thanks, 1970s. Okay, so here are final 2 honorable mentions from the 1970s. Number 7, China's economic opening. Deng Xiaoping's rise in 1978 marked a decisive break from Maoist central planning. Through gradual, the shift towards socialism with Chinese characteristics, again, socialism with Chinese characteristics, laid the foundation for China's manufacturing boom, global supply chains, and today's geopolitical power struggle. Globalization, as we know it, began in a quiet pivot behind the Great Wall in the 1970s. China's opening changed not just where goods were produced, but the very nature of manufacturing jobs in America. The great labor arbitrage began in earnest as companies scoured the globe for the lowest cost labor. Big brands like Nike built their entire fortune on the back of driving down costs through Chinese manufacturing, while many U.S. factories closed or shifted to higher skilled, capital-intensive work. The result was a deep restructuring of the labor markets, one that offered consumers lower prices, but left millions of American workers displaced from the kind of manufacturing jobs that once anchored the middle class. Then number 8, the birth of environmental consciousness. With the founding of the EPA in 1970 and the first Earth Day, environmental policy moved from protest science to permanent institutions. Landmark laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act delivered measurable gains, cutting airborne pollutants, improving water quality, embedding long-term ecological thinking into public governance. Well, that sounds great, of course. But there's always a but. As is the case with many forms of regulation, the challenge is rarely the initial intention. It is knowing when to stop or adjust, especially when that adjustment might require reducing government budgets or scaling back agency authority. A telling example came after the sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants dropped faster than expected in the 1990s. So, rather than recalibrating targets to encourage new innovation, regulators just maintained outdated mandates, almost like they were a hammer and they just kept hammering, even though the hammer wasn't needed anymore. So they maintained outdated mandates, locking utilities into expensive retrofits that provided little additional environmental benefit. The result of the heavy regulatory growth is often dysfunctional outcomes, such as greenwashing. Greenwashing is when a company spends more time and money marketing itself as environmentally friendly than actually putting in the work to minimize its environmental damage. What began an activism became regulation and now underpins everything from ESG investing to carbon markets. Thanks, 1970s. All right, so we've just gone through 8 high impact, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, but 8 high impact changes and implementations, policies from the 1970s. So let's bring it forward. What does that mean today? So let's talk about that. First, let's discuss the current U.S. debt rollover crisis. The national debt today, unconstrained by goal, is now much higher relative to GDP. As interest rates surge, right, with higher inflation today, as interest rates surge, the U.S. faces a roll the debt problem. That is, refinancing the higher existing debt and the higher interest rates creates a double whammy. It's a massive, unsustainable increase in debt service reminiscent of the 2008 toxic mortgage. Wow. Okay. Next, how about congressional gridlock and declining lawmaking? Well, that's still going on. Once a dynamic lawmaking body, Congress has ossified. Party polarization and primary system distortions have turned compromise into career risk, sidelining legislative productivity. Our legislators have changed. The people attracted to Congress. They used to be deliberative and highly skilled negotiators. Well, and I miss them. Today, their primary skill seems to be political theater and social media management and engagement. So then we have the rise of Trump and political polarization. Trump's rise reflects deep voter alienation and institutional distrust. Now, so first of all, whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, and I kind of move away from that. I have my personal feelings, but those aren't important here. What is important is what he represents, okay? And Trump's rise reflects deep voter alienation and institutional distrust. The collapse of party filters and the surge of performative media culture amplified by his masterful use of social media open space for celebrity populism. Moving to Texas now, we have Austin's resistance to upzoning. Despite the housing crisis, progressive cities resist zoning reform. Exclusionary land use laws persist under the guise of neighborhood character, another name for racism, driving costs up and opportunity down. My head scratcher is, why does a very small group of people get to make the decisions to keep the majority of people out of affordable housing? It literally makes no sense to me. So then earlier this year in 2025, you remember the whole TikTok thing? So TikTok's algorithm created a US-China tensions. So what happened was TikTok's influence in shaping and shortening youth attention spans and the data flows highlights new age geopolitical risk. What began with China's opening now challenges Western information sovereignty. Then we get to the environment is getting attention. with ESG regulation and greenwashing. ESG scoring systems face increasing scrutiny because they often focus on corporate risk protection and checking the compliance process boxes rather than measuring a company's real-world social and environmental impact. This flawed measurement is compounded by a lack of global standardization, which leads to wildly inconsistent ratings and contributes to aggregate confusion. Ultimately, the well-intentioned push for these scores often results in greenwashing, where the focus shifts to achieve a high score instead of driving meaningful and sustainable change. So I'm a big fan of what's called Goodhart's Law, and this is a perfect example of Goodhart's Law. And Goodhart's Law is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So targeting environmental concerns is actually making the underlying environmental challenges, it's ceasing, those are ceasing to become good measures. And honestly, I don't even know that they ever were a good measure to begin with. So as a banker, I'll never forget the Dodd-Frank Act, and neither should you. So this was financial reform following the Great Recession. Remember, that started in 2008 and basically went on for a good part of a decade. So what it did is it revived regulatory complexity. It mirrored the 1970s shift away from market freedom and toward fairness-based administrative oversight. Since I'm a banker, I did have a front row seat to all the regulatory action. I did see firsthand how bad behavior of all agents involved created the great financial crisis. I just think we've oversteered, and in our well-intended desire to make sure this does not happen again. So finally, we have Trump's recent most favored nation drug pricing executive order. This ties U.S. prescription drug prices to the lowest prices in comparable nations, aiming to reduce costs through global benchmarking. Okay, so this may sound great, but here's the problem. Price controls never work. I want to say that again. Price controls never work. They just don't. I can state this categorically with conviction. Think of the price as a result of a system. If we don't like the price, we need to fix the system. Price controls literally, while we think we're putting a Band-Aid on something, it's actually the opposite. Price controls just add fuel to the fire. Okay. These examples illustrate how the rules, incentives, and defaults built in the 1970s still shape both public policy and personal experience today. Clearly, there are many other examples, from the structure of digital platforms to the behavior of political leaders. We are living downstream from the choices made in the 1970s. Such a pivotal decade. So, thanks so much for joining me on this time travel journey back from the 1970s back to the 1970s and then forward to today. So let's wrap up. The 1970s did not just signal the end of an era. They launched the system that defines our modern world. This decade untethered money from gold, restructured the democratic process, and birthed the attention economy. It realigned regulatory priorities, opened China's economy, redefined environmental consciousness, and institutionalized land use exclusion. Together, these 8 megatrends quietly rewired the incentives behind how we govern, how we spend, and how we think. These were not just temporary shocks, they were foundational shifts that altered the architecture of power, moving it from tangible assets to monetary discretion, from voters to funders, from institutions to algorithms. Understanding the 1970s is not an exercise in nostalgia. It is a strategic imperative. To make better decisions today, financially, politically, and personally, we must first understand the deep structures we inherited from this pivotal decade. Once and only then can we begin to redesign them. So the 1970s did not fade, they embedded. So let me say that again. The 1970s did not fade, they embedded, and their influence is still unfolding. So, what does this mean to you? First, understanding these structural shifts is not just an academic exercise, it's a strategic advantage. So, for individuals, in an age where information is abundant, but attention is scarce, I'm using those words carefully. In an age where information is abundant, but attention is scarce, how you make decisions matters more than ever. The systems launched in the 1970s rewired the modern world and now require you to adapt. Navigating today's world means curating high-quality decision-relevant information, using structured tools and frameworks, especially for high-stakes financial choices, and then recognizing the biases and incentives embedded in the platforms and institutions you rely upon. Success no longer comes from accessing more data. It comes from applying better decision process. Again, success no longer comes from accessing more data. It comes from applying better decision process. I invite you to take our class, read our book, check out our idea incubator, use our decision technology, or otherwise just join us on our personal finance reimagined journey. Now, for businesses and government leaders, these historic shifts form the baseline for your strategic planning. Whether you're crafting policy, running a business, or leading a nonprofit, understanding the incentives and system structures behind modern challenges enables smarter decisions. At Personal Finance Reimagined, we believe business success comes from a consistent, repeatable decision process, which is why we center our approach on strategic scenario planning and decision making. This disciplined process of envisioning multiple plausible futures turns market uncertainty into actionable understanding, replacing financial confusion with preparation and decision-making. By grounding your strategy in first principles and anticipating market disruption, scenario planning empowers you to make decisions today, leading to confident, lifelong wealth building tomorrow. To guide the future, you must first understand the past, not just what happened, but why. The 1970s built the infrastructure of today's complexity. Your success depends on how well you navigate it. Thank you.